Okay, so now I want to talk about sanding and finishing. We're at a point yesterday, or the last video I showed you, where we started to use the file and the rasp to start to create some pattern work in the heart itself, which is something that you can certainly do. But today we're going to start to talk about actually sanding and making this a nice smooth finish. So quickly first, I just want to go back through the rasps or the files on how to dress the sides of this so that we are ready for sandpaper. Because one of the most common mistakes that students make is that they want to rush through all of the different things without actually getting the material to where it needs to be in order to move on to the sandpaper. So you saw me yesterday, or the last video, shaping the side of the heart using a coarse file, the flat side of a coarse file, as opposed to the beveled side. So again, if I need to make any adjustments to the actual shape of this heart, I'm going to use the coarse file. I have to use the coarse file. Once I get the shape set up where I want it, then I'm going to go on to the medium and the fine files, and I'm going to go through here and take out some of the marks that are left from this file. So again, the fine file, I'm going to spend a minute just going through here and using the file to take some of those marks out. Now again, if you don't spend enough time with the right file, you're never going to get those marks out, and then when you do get down to the finer sandpapers, you're going to be left with all of these different marks here, and you're going to be asking why. And then you're going to have to come back to the file again. So take your time, make sure that you get things the way that you want them before you make the next step. I said this in the last video, but I'll say it again. When I'm using a file, I'm pushing in one direction and then literally picking the file up and then pushing again and picking the file up and pushing again. When I'm filing here, I'm moving pretty quickly because I've done this enough times that I understand how the tool works. But in the beginning, again, you're pushing in one direction, picking the file up, and then coming back and pushing in the same direction. And again, this is my top or my finish side, this is my bottom, and the chip out will be in this direction, which is fine because I'm not going to see the bottom, so I'm not that concerned with it. So again, I'm just going to dress the edge using the fine file in order to be able to get the surface where I want it. Step. And I mentioned this in the past video also. As you get or make this a little bit smoother, what you're going to start to see are the grain patterns here. They start to become really pronounced. I can see them very easily. So that you'll see that it becomes very clear as I go through the sandpaper here. So once I'm done with the files, I'm then going to move on to sandpaper. And in our class, we go through 5 different types of sandpaper. Typically speaking, sandpaper is rated by grit, or the number of grains of sand per square inch on the paper. And every single sandpaper has an associated number with it. So for the heaviest grit sandpaper, if I flip it over, you'll see where it says 80D. That means that there are 80 granules of sand per square inch. From 80, I'm going to move on to 120. So that means that there's going to be 120 grits of sand per square inch, so it's getting finer. And then we go up to 220, 220 pieces of sand, 400, and then where we stop, usually, typically speaking, is 600. So this is very, very fine. So this would be the most coarse at 80, and then it gets finer and finer as we move to 600. So again, I can't skip over. I can't go from 80 to 400 without going to 120, 220, 400. Otherwise, I'm not going to get what I want in terms of how this is supposed to look. Okay? So take your time. Make sure you spend enough time with each one of the sandpapers. I usually say about 2 or 3 minutes per grit in order to get this where you want it, but it could vary based on what your material looks like. Okay? What I typically do is I'll take my sandpaper and fold it in half. I'm looking for a relatively clear section to work with. So I'm going to hold it in my hand. I use my thumb as the way that I add pressure when I'm sanding this. So sometimes I'll use both thumbs with like a two-hand, like here, Sometimes I'll just use one thumb depending on what I want to do. But that's how I apply pressure while I'm sanding. So what I'm going to do when I'm sanding, I always want to make sure that I'm moving with the grain pattern. If I'm moving across the grain pattern here, because you can see the grains are moving from my right to my left or my left to my right in this direction. If I sand across the grain pattern, all I'm doing is scratching the wood, the finish, you're destroying the finish. You don't want to do that. You want to move with the grain pattern as best you can. You'll see there are instances where the grains are kind of like heading in a weird direction. As best you can, you're going to move with the grain pattern. Okay? So here I am with 80 grit sandpaper, and really what I'm doing is I'm just trying to take the scratch marks out. So with 80 grit sandpaper, I'm taking the scratch marks out that I left with the fine file. When I use the fine file, I'm taking the scratch marks that I left in it with the coarse file. So I'm just trying to make the scratches smaller and smaller and smaller. So when I come in here and I start sanding this piece of material down, again, you can see I'm using both of my thumbs a little bit. I could just use one thumb. But I'm spending some time sanding. And again, you can see the sawdust coming off here, so I'm pushing pretty hard. The sandpaper is getting a little bit warm, there's friction, okay? And I'm just sanding away here. And again, like I said, if you do this enough times, you'll get the feel for how it's supposed to look to move on to the next sandpaper, but typically it's going to take you about a minute or two to get it there. If your sandpaper gets clogged, see how there's sawdust in here now? You can either flick it, okay? Or you can just flip it over to the other side and find a fresh spot in there. That will make sure that the sandpaper is still cutting, okay? Because if it gets too clogged, it's not working at all, and that's not what you want. Okay, so once I finish with the 80 grit, put that guy down, I'm going to move on to the 120 grit, do the same thing, pull my sandpaper in half, spend a couple minutes, sanding this guy out. Again, you have to spend the time if you want to get the desired result. If you rush it, you will not get the results that you want. And get your hands in there. You'll always see me reaching in, and again, my fingers are smashed, but I have sawdust because I'm always reaching my hands in there to kind of see what things feel like so that I can understand where I would need to sand more and if I have to go back to something. This is kind of the nice part about woodworking, is that you're interacting with the material. So don't be afraid to kind of, watch for splinters as best you can, but you should be putting your hands on the material to say, okay, how does it feel? And can I go from here, or should I go backwards and do some more sanding with some of the other grains? Okay, 120 is good. I'm going to move on to the 220. This is 220. Again, I'm just going to fold it in half. Again, you'll see that the wood changes as you start to get down to the finer grits of sandpaper. It starts to really look clear. And the grain becomes really pronounced. So I'm done with 220, I'm going to move on to 400. Now down in the 400 and 600 realm, the sandpaper gets clogged very quickly because there's so many small grains. So you'll see me moving the sandpaper around a little bit more in order to find a fresh piece. Now it feels really smooth, almost like glass. And then I'm going to go to 600. And at this point, typically speaking, I'm getting very close to being finished. It feels really, really smooth, really nice. The grains are really pronounced here. There really is no fuzziness. If I turn this, hopefully the camera can see a little bit of it, where up here you have like a cloudiness to the grain, that's unfinished, and then down here where I sanded, it looks nice and crisp. That's what I'm looking for. when you're done with the sides of it, you would go to the top. And I just want to go over how to get into some of these cutouts that I put on my heart, how to get in there and sand those real fast. And the procedure is the same. I'm going to spend my time with the 80, the 120, 220, 400, 600, sanding with the grain here. But I just want to talk about some of these divots or these cutouts that I made in the wood and how I can get in there and sand. You can use your finger and try and sand in here a little bit. Sometimes that's kind of difficult. What I teach my students, or what I tell my students, is to take a pencil or something round and just take the sandpaper and you can just wrap it around it. Then you can even slide it off, whatever it is. I call it my sandpaper sausage because it really is like a little sausage. And then what happens is I can get that in there and it will fill that gap a little bit to be able to sand in there. Now, again, typically speaking, I want to try and sand with the grain as best I can. I know that it's kind of facing in this direction, my cutout, but I'm still kind of sort of like sanding, because you can see the grain pattern here. I'm kind of sanding in this direction. I definitely don't want to sand in this direction. That would be wrong. Okay? So I'm going to go down here with my 80 grit and kind of start to smooth things out. Now, again, this will get you to a professional finish here. And when you're taking this out of the classroom and you're going to potentially give it to somebody or put it on your nightstand or put it on your dresser, you definitely want to have something that is finished. People will, appreciate it more. You'll appreciate it more. So spend the time with the sandpaper and make sure that you get all your marks out and everything cleaned up. Now, the other thing I'll say before we end this one is I still have some of my layout lines here that are in pencil. We do things in pencil in this class because if we use sandpaper, watch what happens to my pencil marks. If I sit here for just an instant and I go over this with 80 grit sandpaper, I'm literally just cutting the pencil mark away. Pencil does not soak into the wood like pen does. Pen actually soaks in and is permanent. You won't be able to get that out. So if I just go over this for a second, you can see where my pencil marks disappear with a little bit of sanding and things look nice and crisp and perfect. So that is sanding in a nutshell.